Hello and welcome back to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. So we already know that one thing climate change is doing is causing sea levels to rise and putting coastal cities and towns in peril. But who exactly is to blame for the damages done by the changing climate, and who should front at least part of the bill to manage these impacts? Well, the city of Baltimore, Maryland has proposed the idea that the oil and gas companies that knew about the dangers of the continuous use of fossil fuels prior to the public being aware of them are at least partially to blame and are liable for the damage that their alleged negligence has caused. Baltimore is so serious, in fact, about this claim that they are taking these companies to court. And now we must ask the question, are oil companies liable for the damages caused by climate change? So, of course, we're going to talk about this question. So go ahead and grab your snowflake beverage of choice and let's get into this. Before we dive into the topic here, I would just like to remind you that if you want to see any more of my future environment, conservation, and educational and outdoorsy videos, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you enjoy this topic, give me a like. If you think I'm full of crap, go ahead, give me a dislike. I don't really care. And if you have something to say, please do comment down below. It is always fascinating for me when people leave me comments. All right, with that out of the way, a short synopsis of this situation. So the city of Baltimore is taking more than a dozen oil and gas companies to court. These companies include BP, Exxon Mobil, and Shell, as well as other big oil and gas companies. And this particular lawsuit was actually announced back in 2018. So it's not exactly the freshest, hottest news, but there are reasons that this case has begun to make its rounds in the news cycle again, and we will get into that in just a second. But the other important thing to keep in mind here is that this case is not the only case of a city taking these fossil fuel companies to court. This is actually only one of more than 20 similar cases in the recent years. And this particular case is filed in state court in the state of Maryland. But the oil companies are arguing that this is a federal issue, not a state issue. So the case is filed in the wrong court. And the reason why this case is kind of making news again is because the Supreme Court of the United States actually heard arguments on January 19th. And the question that they heard arguments on was actually, where should this case be tried, in state or federal courts? So let's get into the actual claim from the city of Baltimore in the state of Maryland and what this case is about. So the actual claim in this case coming from Baltimore is that these fossil fuel companies are responsible for the costs of climate change because these companies knew about the dangers of fossil fuels long before the public was made aware, and they allegedly misled the public about these dangers that, again, they knew about. Their scientists had actually already projected things that we're seeing today. This is not some claim grabbed out of the blue. This is something that has actually been discussed in these scientific circles and in the kind of educational circles for a while now. And another claim is that climate change is causing the following in Baltimore as well as in other places. So being that Baltimore is a coastal city, they are seeing a lot of extra flood damage. We're also seeing deadly heat waves with increases in things like heat stroke and asthma-related hospitalizations. So the costs associated with both of those, as well as massive infrastructure failures in the way of drainage pipes bursting because they can't handle the storm systems that are going through the area right now, as well as sinkholes forming in roadways, likely linked to drainage pipe failures as well. And all of this is going to cost tens of millions of dollars in reparations on top of hundreds of millions of dollars for upgrades. And the argument here is that had places already known about the dangers, they would have been able to make these upgrades over the decades that they would have had time to do it and not need to scramble now to make the upgrades and make the reparations, costing, again, tens of millions of dollars on top of hundreds of millions of dollars. So we have one quote here from Andre Davis, who was the solicitor of Baltimore at the time that the lawsuit was filed. This quote is from the press conference when the lawsuit was actually announced back in 2018. These companies must be held accountable. Climate change is a reality. The companies knew of the harm decades ago. If it had been disclosed, the problem of climate change could have been mitigated significantly. That is our claim. So that just kind of wraps up exactly what they're accusing these big fossil fuel companies of. Basically, knowing that this stuff could happen and negligently withholding that information and possibly even misleading people about how safe their products were. So the rebuttal from the fossil fuel companies doesn't necessarily address any of these claims directly. The main rebuttal is that this issue is a federal, not a state issue. Again, their rebuttal is that this issue is a federal, not a state issue. And so let's take a look at a brief that has been filed in support of the oil and gas companies. This brief comes from Phil Goldberg, who is an attorney with Shook, Hardy, and Bacon in Washington, D.C., and he represents the National Association of Manufacturers, which is the association that did file a brief in support of the oil and gas companies, and this quote directly comes from Goldberg. This isn't something the energy companies created. This is a byproduct of modern society. All the companies are doing is engaging in a lawful business endeavor, and what that is selling us, the energy we need to drive our cars, turn on our lights, heat and cool our homes. And doing that is not a liability-causing event. So, again, basically their whole rebuttal is this issue needs to be decided at the federal level, not the state level, and not our fault. We were just doing business. So we'll get into that in just a moment when we talk about kind of my thoughts on everything. So how exactly is the Supreme Court involved here if this case is filed at that state level? That's the next question we need to address. Well, they're literally just ruling on the question of if this is a federal issue or not, because again, the oil and gas companies, their main answer to the claim from Baltimore is that this is a federal issue and shouldn't be tried in the state court anyway. So the arguments that the Supreme Court actually heard a few days ago was that whether or not this was a federal state issue, it actually didn't have anything to do with the actual case other than where it should actually be tried. And they've said that they will give their decision sometime this year. So that can mean tomorrow, that can mean December 31st, who knows? And so the oil and gas companies, basically, they want this to be a federal issue because that would basically void the current Baltimore case. It would have to be refiled in federal courts. And if it is decided to not be a federal issue, it's possible that it could basically pave the way for all of the other climate change liability lawsuits issued against those oil and gas companies. And they will be looking at more than just being on the hook for what's going on in Baltimore. So to kind of sum all that stuff up, we're going to look at what Karen Sokol, a law professor from Loyola University in New Orleans, who's written extensively about the climate liability issues, said. They're basically fighting to keep this out of state court because they're desperate to keep the social license that they've cultivated with this disinformation campaign. It has never been held to account in this way in this country. It has wielded such economic and political might. It's never had to face a threat quite like this. So basically what she's saying is that they want the case at the federal level so they aren't held accountable for any misinformation that still remains a secret. They don't want to be held accountable for withholding the information that they had decades ago from the public. So the oil and gas companies have a vested interest in making sure this goes to the federal level, where we have a court that will be more sympathetic to them than to the cities and the environmental groups that want these oil and gas companies to be held accountable for what they've essentially been doing from the very beginning. So what exactly are my thoughts on this whole thing? Now, remember, from here on out, these are my thoughts and opinions, and anything that I say is alleged. So my thoughts are that these oil and gas companies should be held accountable for their part in the climate change situation that we're currently finding ourselves in. It is a fact that they already had the information that the continuous reliance on fossil fuels would cause disaster globally. And had this information been brought to the attention of the public sooner, then action could have been taken and we could have already shifted away from fossil fuels. And I know the usual argument to that point is that that would have killed the fossil fuel industry and put millions of people out of work. Well, no, it necessarily would not have killed those companies, because they could have been the ones paving the way for the clean energy. They could have been the ones doing the research and training the people to work in those industries and shifted their primary labor force from the fossil fuels to the freaking clean energy. So no, it would not have had to kill the industry. But they didn't really want people to know that, because it would have taken money to do the research, and fossil fuel companies aren't known for really wanting to better the planet, now are they? So what do I think that the Supreme Court is going to say? I think that they're going to rule in favor of the oil and gas companies. I think they're going to rule that this is a federal, not a state issue. And the reasons I think this are because our Supreme Court is very conservative. The Trump administration made sure of that. And very conservative views tend to go hand in hand with fossil fuel sympathies. And the right already spreads that false narrative that shifting away from fossil fuels will cause economic disaster. So conservative Supreme Court and that false narrative that moving away from fossil fuel equal bad is going to likely mean that they're going to say this is a federal issue. And then if this gets tried in federal court, I think everything's going to go in the way of the fossil fuel industry. Now, I hope that my prediction is wrong and that it's determined that this is going to be a case that can be decided at the state level, because if it is, then the oil and gas companies are going to see some sort of accountability. However, if it is determined at the state level, the courts will likely side in favor of the cities and the oil and gas companies will be held accountable. However, I'm certain they will just escalate it back up the legal ladder, up to that federal level, and then we'll see what happens. However, if it is decided at the state level, the other climate change liability cases will also be able to go through, and these fossil fuel companies will be facing accountability for more than just that city of Baltimore. So to kind of wrap things up and put a little bow on it, fossil fuel companies want to avoid being held responsible for their part in anthropogenic causes of climate change that absolutely could have been mitigated had they allowed what they already knew to become public knowledge, and they actually took some goddamn responsibility and paved the way for clean energy research. Because the fossil fuel companies that conservatives just love to suck the dick of 100% could have been the leaders in clean energy had they been willing to put a small percentage of their profits towards that research. And while they did not literally cause the damage we see today, they did negligently hide that information that could have changed where we are now. So that's my thoughts on the matter. That's what's going on. If I see updates in this, I will for sure update y'all. So again, hit that subscribe button if you want to keep up to date on what goes on with this situation. We also have our wolf saga situation that's going on that I am for sure keeping a close eye on because I care about conservation and ecosystems. So if you also care about conservation and ecosystems, why don't you give me a like? So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you, and I will see you all in the next one.
Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.